In Nietzsche's notebooks from 1885, in a passage he never published, we find a curious section in which Nietzsche credits Hume with authoring a salient critique of causality, and at the same time suggests that Hume's approach ought to be subject to his own critique. Nietzsche writes, quote, Hume challenges, to use Kant's words, reason to explain by what right it presumes that something can be of such a nature that if it is posited, something else must necessarily also be posited. For that is what the concept of cause implies. He proved irrefutably that it is utterly impossible for reason to conceive of such a connection a priori and from concepts, etc. But the folly lay in asking for reasons for the right of justification. He performed the very act he was attempting to examine. End quote. Nietzsche plainly agrees with Hume that it is impossible for reason to come up with a justification for a necessary connection, to use Hume's language, such that an object is necessarily connected to another object as the effect is connected to the cause. We can't do so through concepts, through the operations of reason alone. Neither can we appeal to an a priori principle for Hume. And yet Nietzsche argues Hume's approach is folly, because he's asking for reasons for the right of justification. In other words, Hume is asking, by what reason can we say that we have a right to justify the belief in cause and effect? And by following this line of reasoning, Nietzsche says, Hume performs the act he was attempting to examine, meaning he finds a right to justify cause and effect. And even though he does so through habit, he gets there through his philosophy. Given our analysis of inquiry concerning human understanding in the previous episode, I think we can say Nietzsche's criticism is hard to avoid, because Hume tells us that his aim is not to dissuade us from believing in those inferences that we naturally draw, of necessary connections between impressions and between effects and causes. He says from the time we were in the cradle, we made this inference, without the help of reason. Animals draw the same inferences without the help of reason. Hume writes, quote, this operation of the mind by which we infer like effects from like causes and vice versa is so essential to the subsistence of all human creatures, it is not probable that it could be trusted to the fallacious deductions of our reason. End quote. And this is a typical Nietzschean stylistic move where it seems as though he's praising Hume at first, and then in the last sentence he turns about and criticizes him. And it's on this basis that Hume's work ostensibly critiques the framework of causality only in order to justify it, as part of a move to justify it. It's really a search for where we get the right of justification, the right to say cause and effect is justified. And so even though Hume operates as an empiricist and he puts forward the arguments of a skeptic, he ultimately produces not an empiricist work, not a scientific work based on experimental data, but a rational argument. And this is Nietzsche's qualm with Hume. Their respective arguments as regards causality appear to be very similar, but ultimately Nietzsche is not aimed at a philosophical position that refers back to the sensibilities of the common person, whereas Hume places his philosophy in subserviency to the easy and obvious philosophy of common sense. Nietzsche, on the other hand, positions his philosophy as antagonistic to everything common. Now, if I were to take a critical eye to Nietzsche's claims, I would have to say that, depending on how you look at it, I don't even think Nietzsche escapes his own criticism here. And what I mean by this is that causality is just as much a target for Nietzsche as it is for Hume. Nietzsche argues that causality should be sourced to our perception of the world, rather than understood as something out there in the world. Both of them advance the argument that we're habituated to believe in cause and effect. Both of them hold that we do not challenge cause and effect because of fear of the consequences. And even though Nietzsche doesn't philosophize in service of our habitual beliefs, quite the contrary, he does argue that causality can be counted amongst those quote-unquote truths that he defines as the kind of error that is found to be indispensable for life. We simply can't help but think in terms of cause and effect in order to cognize the world. Without causality, Remember, this is part of the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason for Schopenhauer. So without it, we would be unable to reason about the world. We'd be lost. We'd be unable to draw the inferences necessary for us to survive. You could even go so far as to say that cause and effect is how the world appears to us, and Nietzsche makes this point. Isn't Nietzsche's project to affirm appearance? In fact, Nietzsche writes in a note contained in Will to Power 476, quote, "Our inner world too, appearance," end quote. In fact, Nietzsche's anti-metaphysical revolution requires that we collapse the separation between the quote-unquote external world and the mind that perceives it. We see by means of our human head, as Nietzsche says, and we can't cut it off, and were we to do so, nothing would be left of the world either, at least not for us. Causality, along with concepts such as line, form, bodies, substance, extension, and so on, they are the shadows of God, that metaphysical residue of being in our code of signifiers, by which we understand the world. But it's not as if we can simply will ourselves not to think in terms of causality or substances. Nietzsche's philosophy could give us to understand that these propositions are totally unfounded and unjustified on a logical basis, but not on the level of appearance. We can't point to causality as a truth in the Platonic sense, a truth independent of the human mind. And yet, if it is a truth contingent on the human mind, and upon which all of our perceptions depend, upon which they are contingent, then we arrive at a place where we affirm causality not because it's true, but because it's necessary. And I think when things are framed in this way, it's very hard, therefore, to draw a substantial difference between Nietzsche and Hume, in spite of the criticism Nietzsche makes. Hume falls back on a justification through nature, through a kind of instinctual activity of drawing inferences based on repeated experience. Nietzsche falls back on certain metaphysical assumptions that are erroneous, but nevertheless necessary, and they are the way things appear in our inner world. As such, it may seem difficult to distinguish the two. But there's a deeper level to this, and if I were to steelman Nietzsche's criticism, it would be by employing Nietzsche's understanding of philosophical thought as a confession of an impulse. Deleuze wrote that the important question for Nietzsche is who, as in who is speaking. That's how he analyzes Nietzsche's preoccupation with types, his perspectivism, and his practice of genealogy. It's all sort of tied into this. Very different forces can be operative in two different people who are making the same argument. And Nietzsche, therefore, inquires into who is speaking and the history of their impulses in order to understand the real logic of the argument. We have to ask the question, who is speaking? Or rather, which impulse is speaking through the philosopher? Which force is seizing him? And I think we can understand Nietzsche's objections to Hume really more on this level. As Hume says, as an agent, as an active being who has to operate within the world and who has certain day-to-day needs, I have no problem understanding cause and effect. In a way, his argument's power is in pointing out how we possess what are effectively articles of faith from a strictly rational standpoint, that nevertheless we don't challenge because we believe in these things for reasons other than, well, rational reasons. Hume has attempted to show us just how suspicious reason is, not how suspicious cause and effect is. At least that's one way of reading Hume. And Nietzsche, on the other hand, wants to do the opposite. He wants to call into question cause and effect. He wants to make causality appear suspicious, but for a different set of goals, a different set of impulses is driving him. He wants us to see how it's something that we've been enculturated to believe for instrumental reasons. Within the framework of causality, we consider human beings as autonomous subjects who are morally responsible for their actions, so that they can be punished for their actions. Nietzsche calls into question the entire moral regime based on causality. Nietzsche would even admit that thinking beyond causality and beyond substance, beyond being, that may well be beyond us as we are now. And such thinking might, in fact, deliver our society to ruin. But he nevertheless wants to run the experiment and see how far we can push our criticisms of these apparently indispensable errors. Maybe if humanity in general can't think in terms of becoming and can't think beyond causality and being, maybe there are specific cases of people who can. Everything proceeds by slow steps. We've been enculturated in one direction. Maybe we can enculturate ourselves gradually in the other direction. And at the grandest possible scale, and thus spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche even imagines a kind of human life which would be, from our standpoint, superhuman, which doesn't just involve health in the physical sense, but in the psychical sense. The overman is the notion of a new type of being descended from humanity, but who would overcome humanity, overcome the shadows of God that continue to darken our minds. And so, however similar their arguments appear, very different impulses are driving these two thinkers. Hume's philosophy is a path leading back to common sense. Nietzsche's philosophy is a path leading beyond humanity itself. But having established that point, the basis on which Nietzsche would contrast himself with Hume, which we will circle back to by the end of the episode, the substance of their arguments as regards causality, it has to be said, again, it's very, very similar. We spent a great deal of the previous episode analyzing Hume's arguments as regards causality. Now we'll look at Nietzsche's arguments. It's worth considering the background of his attack on causality, which is intimately related to the free will idea. While Nietzsche attacks the concept of free will very early in his career, in fact, in his first major philosophical work, Human All Too Human, this early attack on free will is very different from the criticisms he would later make about the idea when he's in this sort of post-causality mindset. To be clear, Nietzsche never writes in favor of libertarian free will, but his early criticisms are based on a kind of mechanistic refutation of the idea that the will could be a spontaneous, uncaused cause, an almost magical force, which is, again, different from his his later critiques, rather. And this is in Human All Too Human, number 106, quote, "When we see a waterfall, we think we see freedom of will and choice in the innumerable turnings, windings, breakings of the waves. But everything is necessary. Each movement can be calculated mathematically. Thus it is with human actions. If one were omniscient, one would be able to calculate each individual action in advance, each step in the progress of knowledge, each error, each act of malice. To be sure, the acting man is caught in his illusion of volition. If the wheel of the world were to stand still for a moment, and an omniscient calculating mind were there to take advantage of this interruption, he would be able to tell into the farthest future of each being, and describe every rut that wheel will roll upon. The acting man's delusion about himself, his assumption that free will exists, is also part of the calculable mechanism." End quote. That passage brings to mind Spinoza's thrown stone. He says that a stone thrown through the air, if it were conscious, would claim to have chosen at every moment to follow the arc it follows, as it soars towards its inevitable and predetermined destination. In Nietzsche's case, he says, because the movements of the water, the way each droplet splashes and leaps and plummets, because that could never be calculated. It's too complicated. We become caught in the illusion of volition, and that it's the same with human beings and our own actions. The impetus for our actions is so complex that we can't comprehend it, but if we could, we would find that we're like the waterfall. Now, eventually, Nietzsche will turn against the mechanistic critique of free will altogether, and he begins to question whether there is any factuality to the concept of cause and effect at all, which means the will can't be a cause. Neither can anything else, however, and so in this way, Nietzsche's later critique of free will again resemble Hume. But the way Nietzsche arrives at this critique of causality is through his critique of free will, which is why we're starting here. It's another important difference between the two. They arrive at a similar place, but by very different paths, as if they're meeting somewhere on the road, having walked from opposite directions. It seems to me that in Nietzsche's case, his early mechanistic criticisms of free will convince him that it is a delusion. And even in Human All Too Human, he already begins to pose the question, why the delusion? And that's a very important question for Nietzsche. He says in Human All Too Human, number 39, quote, "No one is responsible for his deeds, no one for his nature. To judge is to be unjust. This is also true when the individual judges himself. This tenet is as bright as sunlight, and yet everyone prefers to walk back into the shadow of untruth for fear of the consequences." End quote. And it's funny because the metaphor of light and shade appears here just as it appears in Hume's work. But remember, for Hume, the philosopher is in the shade. Perhaps he's in the dark of his ivory tower, and then when he comes out into the light, he just follows the normal necessities of life. He goes with habit. He doesn't need to have a logical basis for the inferences he draws. And so his philosophical abstractions vanish when he leaves the shade. For Nietzsche, he's saying here, we have this belief in free will, that's the shadow of untruth. My reason has led me into the light of the sunlight of knowledge, effectively. And it's the consequences that keep us from acknowledging the bright light of this truth. And this works as a provisional explanation. It's not a complete explanation, but it points Nietzsche in the direction, right? Why should we affirm the belief in something so obviously incorrect from a logical or empirical standpoint unless there's some necessity in it, some need fulfilled by the belief? Ordinarily, we might think of debates in metaphysics as, abstract and disconnected from the concerns of ordinary life, but without this belief in the metaphysical error of free will, our morality would become impossible. And so it's because of the need for our morality that we affirm free will. See, for example, Human All Too Human 107, quote, "Man's complete lack of responsibility for his behavior and for his nature is the bitterest drop of knowledge man must swallow if he had been in the habit of seeing responsibility and duty as humanity's claim to nobility. All his judgments, distinctions, dislikes have thereby become worthless and wrong. The deepest feeling he had offered a hero or a victim was misdirected. He may no longer praise, no longer blame, for it is nonsensical to praise and blame nature and necessity. He can admire strength, beauty, abundance, but he may not find any earned merit in them. Chemical processes and the clash of elements, these have no more earned merit than do those inner struggles and crises in which a man is torn back and forth by various motives until he finally decides for the most powerful." End quote. And further in the passage, Nietzsche essentially comes to the conclusion that everywhere, regardless of the circumstances, people are seeking their own preservation and their own pleasure. As such, good actions are what he calls sublimated evil actions, and evil actions are good actions made coarse and stupid. This also very much accords with Hume's idea of morality deriving from sentiment, by the way. But we'll get to that in a little while here. But that means that the same impulses are at the root of everything we call good, as well as what we call evil, which Nietzsche identifies here as chemical processes, the clash of the elements. It's all nature. The inability to praise or blame or to give merit or shame to things means there's no guilt or innocence. There's no justice or injustice. And so we have to appeal to we have to have recourse to a pia fraus, a holy lie, in order to keep the moral regime working. And at this time, Nietzsche would seem to be all in favor of this. And in fact, he says this is how man becomes the super animal, quote unquote, by lying to himself and becoming moral through this dissimulation. That's how we move beyond nature, because now we no longer live according to blind impulse. It's very funny to compare that with later Nietzsche's ideas on, what is superhuman or super animal. And so this is Human All Too Human number 40, quote, "The beast in us wants to be lied to. Morality is a white lie, to keep it from tearing us apart. Without the errors inherent in the postulates of morality, man would have remained an animal. But as it is, he has taken himself to be something higher and has imposed stricter laws upon himself." End quote. Now, if we move forward a bit to the gay science, Nietzsche begins to apply his criticism of free will to the doctrine of cause and effect more generally. He links the two, for example, in a passage in which he's criticizing Schopenhauer for situating the will as the most fundamental reality of life. Nietzsche argues that Schopenhauer took the oldest prejudice of mankind and simply put it in philosophical language. He'll say something similar later in Beyond Good and Evil, where he says that what Schopenhauer did for the concept of will is what all philosophers do. He took a popular prejudice and exaggerated it. And Nietzsche would say that this prejudice finds its most distant origins in the ancient religions, the superstitions that Hume is always battling with, in the idea that all things are full of gods. Every phenomena, every encounter, every natural disaster or unexpected happening beyond the power of the human will, or at least apparently so. Nietzsche says ancient people thought that was the work of a god. This is in The Gay Science number 127, after effect of the most ancient religiosity. Quote, "Man believed originally that wherever he saw something happen, a will had to be at work in the background as a cause, and a personal, willing being. Man believed for immense periods of time only in persons, and not in substances, forces, things, and so forth. Cause and effect became for him the basic faith that he applies wherever anything happens, and this is what he still does instinctively." End quote. So we believed only in persons and not in substances, forces, or things, this modern materialist conception of the world as objects. We projected our inner experience of volition onto the external world. Now, this position is somewhat in tension with Hume. Hume wants to say that our inner world of volition can't provide us with a blueprint for seeing connections in the world, that it's solely a habitual mental activity, but nevertheless one which accords with nature in a kind of pre-established harmony. There's a way in which Hume is sort of satirizing Leibniz with this line, by the way, but I don't think that's as relevant as some other commenters think it is, because he makes numerous appeals to the idea that this method of drawing habitual inferences as regards necessary connection is the mental equipment that nature gave us, and he says explicitly that it's more reliable than reason. Again, the same kind of inferences are presumably drawn by infants and animals. But Hume wants to say that there's no a priori framework of causality that we are given. Causality is discovered by experience and experience alone. It's the faith that the future will be conformable to the past, which serves as a basis for reasoning based on experience. That is what we seem to possess instinctively. But again, it's not a priori knowledge. But Hume takes issue with the idea that we derived this belief in cause and effect from the inner experience of volition, that we have a direct experience of the will of volition causing action. I will my arm to move, and it moves, and so my will is the cause of my arm moving. Hume says, no, it's simply that the experience of the movement of your arm is conjoined with the experience of willing to move your arm. And so the important difference here, albeit perhaps a semantic one, I can't quite nail this down, but Hume would say we don't actually perceive a connection between volition and action, whereas Nietzsche would say people do perceive this. Whether or not they're perceiving something quote-unquote true is another matter, but psychologically speaking, Nietzsche operates from the framework that we do have this perception. Again, to go back to Humanology, Human briefly in 18, quote, "Even today, we think that all our feelings and doings are, at bottom, acts of the free will. When the sentient individual contemplates himself, he deems every feeling, every change, as something isolated, disconnected, that is to say, unqualified by anything. It comes suddenly to the surface, independent of anything that went before or came after." End quote. If we accept Nietzsche's argument in this regard, then we would be led to the position that perhaps the common sense view, its struggle against determinism, comes from this subjective inner experience that tells me my will is free. Nietzsche doesn't think it is actually free, but he thinks we reason erroneously from this inner experience. Hume would say if they examine closer, they'll see they don't actually have a subjective experience that reveals the power behind volition. Nietzsche might say in response, do you really think that people think that hard about this? This is not how the average person reasons, and you should know that, Hume, given your constant injunctions to remember the fallibility of reason. People will adopt explanations in Nietzsche's view for instrumental reasons, regardless of whether those conceptualizations are quote-unquote rationally justified. Now, again, is this just a semantic disputation that I've discovered? Because ultimately Hume would say, my point is just that they don't actually they think they have a subjective experience of something that they never subjectively experience. You never actually have an experience with causality itself, only instances of things being conjoined. But I do think Nietzsche would say we do actually have a subjective experience, because what we subjectively experience to be true, quite in line with Hume, is not derived from reason. That what we even, it's hard to find the words for this exactly, but what we directly experience, the way that we interpret every perception, every event that's happening around us, or actions that we're doing or taking part in, is going to be colored by, there is no just absolute facticity of it, right? We're going to have an interpretation of it according to valuations, all sorts of things. And so I think Nietzsche would say that many people do actually, because they're so bought into this moral way of thinking, they actually do have the subjective experience of free will. There's a passage in The Gay Science number 112, which is entitled Cause and Effect, in which Nietzsche elaborates on this view. He says that causality is not an explanation, it's just a better description than those given by our predecessors. Again, presumably those ancient human beings who simply saw things as acts of the gods. Nietzsche even goes so far in this passage as to suggest that our distant ancestors may have lived in such a way that they did not yet make those necessary connections, perhaps because they had not yet been enculturated to do so. If all of these beliefs are derived by habit, the habits just hadn't been ingrained yet. And Nietzsche thinks that in nature it is at least probably true that no such thing as causality really exists, nor line, substance, bodies, division, and so on. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, "Explanation is what we call it, but it is description that distinguishes us from the older stages of knowledge and science. Our descriptions are better. We do not explain any more than our predecessors. We have uncovered a manifold one after another, where the naive man and inquirer of older cultures saw only two separate things. Cause and effect is what one says, but we have merely perfected the image of becoming without reaching beyond the image or behind it. In every case, the series of causes confronts us much more completely, and we infer, first, this and that has to proceed in order that this and that may then follow. But this does not involve any comprehension. In every chemical process, for example, quality appears as a miracle, as ever. Also, every locomotion. Nobody has explained a push. But how could we possibly explain anything? We operate only with things that do not exist. Lines, planes, bodies, atoms, divisible time spans, divisible spaces. How should explanations be at all possible when we first turn everything into an image, our image? Cause and effect. Such a duality probably never exists. In truth, we are confronted by a continuum out of which we isolate a couple of pieces, just as we perceive motion only as isolated points, and then infer it without ever actually seeing it. The suddenness with which many effects stand out misleads us. Actually, it is sudden only for us. In this moment of suddenness, there is an infinite number of processes that elude us. An intellect that could see cause and effect as a continuum and a flux, and not as we do in terms of an arbitrary division and dismemberment, would repudiate the concept of cause and effect and deny all conditionality." End quote. So we have it referred to as an image. And our descriptions are better. Let's go back to the beginning of the passage. What does it mean? I mean, that's a somewhat indeterminate phrasing, but you might say it's a better story. It's people don't believe in ideas because they're rationally justified. They're conveyed as part of a compelling story. That's the basis of belief. Once again, we also have this idea of unseen factors going on beneath the surface. Like Hume, Nietzsche also says we don't observe the force of motion or any kind of universal law that explains motion. Just like Hume says we don't observe the actual power by which mind and body or volition and action can be united, he makes similar points about motion that can be found in his endless analogies to billiard balls. But once again, Nietzsche poses this possibility of an intelligence that can see cause and effect as a continuum and flux. And he phrases it interestingly when he says we don't perceive becoming itself. What we have are images of becoming. The more sophisticated image, or the more compelling image, doesn't lead to a more quote-unquote accurate picture of the flux. which is what Nietzsche thinks really characterizes the world. So we never peer behind the image. But there is something interesting or implicit in this line of thinking is the possibility of perceiving the image for being an image, to see that it is an image of becoming that we always see, and thus to understand reality as an appearance. Again, this approach may seem as though it leads us back to a division between the true world and the mere appearance, or between the intelligible, thinking about the world versus our sense impressions. But as I brought up at the beginning, Nietzsche doesn't exclude the possibility that we could alter the way the world appears to ourselves. He doesn't want to deny appearance, but he does see the way the world appears as ultimately contingent on many things, deriving back to impulse, interpretation, the will to power, and so on, and a whole genealogy, a whole history. And indeed, this idea is demanded by his philosophical approach, because he's argued that our moral values, our process of civilizing and enculturating human beings, has altered our perspective. That's what shifts with the slave morality and Christianity and so on. The very fact that our metaphysical assumptions about the world are based on our moral ideas points us to this possibility, because that would mean that the reason why we see the world in terms of these conceptions of substances, causes, egos, and wills is because of morality, not some naturally acquired habit of thought. There are a series of valuations at the basis of the way we perceive. If we were to reevaluate those values, then we might arrive at a new image of life along with the new values. And so this means we can't ask the question of whether our image of life, our image of becoming, is correct or incorrect in a sense of conforming to the thing in itself. That would be Platonism again. That would be a Platonic standard for evaluating truth. Nietzsche will eventually develop a competing standard of truth, but for him it's based on health or necessity for life, or something like that. If these shadows of God were indispensable errors that were found to be of value for life, then this ought to give us to understand, as Nietzsche will eventually write in one of his notes, that it is the value for life that ultimately decides what our image of becoming will be. So to take stock of where we are then, Nietzsche thinks that we do project these causal inferences from our own experience of volition, even if it's a quote-unquote false experience in the Platonic sense. Whereas Hume thinks we could not have done so. And Nietzsche does agree with Hume that this is a natural process, quote-unquote, to draw inferences based on connections, but he thinks it's natural insofar as there's another step in the equation, right? Our moral instinct is quote-unquote natural. These metaphysical beliefs are established as part of a morality, and all groups of human beings have their moralities and their tablets of values by which they regulate their societies and attempt to preserve themselves. Whereas for Hume, I get the impression that he thinks these causal inferences are natural in perhaps a more fundamental sense. Because of his skeptical bent, I think Hume would deny that he's come to any such fundamental understanding of the human mind. But that is what he sets out to do, is map a geography of the human mind. And the very fact that he thinks that we can derive no further explanation beyond habit, that we can't explain habit, I think discloses a kind of mystification that's going on here in Hume's doctrines. Hume says that it may not be possible to go back beyond habit in terms of finding an explanation for the explanation. Quote, "Perhaps we can push our inquiries no farther, or pretend to give the cause of this cause, but rest contented with it as the ultimate principle, which we can assign of all our conclusions of experience." End quote. And I want to press a bit further on this point, but there is another similarity to acknowledge that I think is important here. Both Hume and Nietzsche draw attention to the fact that, especially when it comes to the issue of free will, people don't typically appeal to reason in their arguments. They appeal to the instrumentality of the doctrine. And again, the ruination it would bring if we were to not believe in the doctrine. Hume says in Liberty and Necessity, Part 2, quote, "There is no method of reasoning more common, and yet none more blamable, than in philosophical disputes to endeavor the refutation of any hypothesis by a pretense of its dangerous consequences to religion and morality. When any opinion leads to absurdities, it is certainly false, but it is not certain that an opinion is false because it is of dangerous consequence." End quote. Compare this to Will to Power 497. Quote, the most strongly believed a priori truths, quote unquote, are for me provisional assumptions, e.g. the law of causality, a very well-acquired habit of belief, so much a part of us that not to believe in it would destroy the race. But are they for that reason truths? What a conclusion, as if the preservation of man were a proof of truth. End quote. Again, for all their subtle differences, it does seem as though these two minds work along very similar lines. And it's striking that the very concept that Nietzsche chooses as an example of a belief that we acquire by habit, and with which we are not willing to part because of the consequences, that the example he uses is causality, the very doctrine that Hume centers as his proof that we draw our beliefs by habit. In other words, habit explains why we believe in causality, but what explains habit? And Hume satisfies himself with the argument that this is simply the way we do things. Perhaps as a principle of nature, perhaps we can say no more than to call it an instinct. If we go on looking for reasons for habit, we'll be missing the point that habit or custom is the great guide of life. We would instead be looking for reasons to affirm habit, making reason the guide of life again. For Hume, that would be backwards. He says, we can't but affirm habit. It's not a choice. That is the way we do things, regardless of the reasons for it, should we discover them. But in some sense, it's just sort of like saying, it's like the asinine questions Dot would ask in the Animaniacs, right? Why? Why is the sky blue? Why is a rock hard? Eventually you just have to say, that's the way it is. So for Hume, he says that we can't not but reason this way, or but think this way. So we don't need an explanation for the explanation. It's one of those ideas that of the philosophers that would vanish the moment that he leaves the shade, as Hume says. But Nietzsche can't be satisfied with this because he, again, is on this fundamentally different philosophical project. He doesn't think that habit is something which is of itself a form of necessity. In other words, habit is contingent on these other things, as we've said. Different cultures, different moralities foster different habits, and are themselves fostered by differing habitual behaviors and thought patterns. It seems evident that on the individual level, habits can be altered, even if one must do so gradually. Further, that changes in geography, changes in the necessities of life, and changes in one's adversaries, changes in diet and climate, any number of things can lead to changes in habits. Why would our habit of reasoning based on the idea that the future is conformable to the past, why would that be any different? And perhaps that's one of the ways in which Hume, as a forerunner of Kant, must be seen in that period of philosophy, which is, from the perspective of those of us after Hegel and Darwin and Nietzsche, Hume is prehistorical. I don't mean prehistoric. It's a philosophy that takes place before the historical turn, which treats with this idea of truth as eternal and unchanging. Now, that's not an explicit metaphysical position in Hume, but there doesn't seem to be much of a logic of development or much of an interest in the genealogy of habit in Hume. I'll just put it like that. Whereas, Nietzsche doesn't ever think in terms of stasis, in which there could be this one essentialized set of habits, even mental habits, by which, humanity understands things and people structure their actions and so on. Habit, like everything else, is something that does evolve for Nietzsche, and which does have a history and does have a genealogy. Now, I keep going back to human all too human in this passage, even though we are eventually going to get beyond it. But this one is important to show the early roots of some ideas that we're going to discuss from Nietzsche's later work. But this is an early explanation for habit, as early as Human all too human. This is from section 97. Quote, an important type of pleasure, and thus an important source of morality, grows out of habit. One does habitual things more easily, skillfully, gladly. One feels a pleasure at them, knowing from experience that the habit has stood the test and is useful. A morality one can live with has been proved salutary, effective, in contrast to all the as yet unproven new experiments. Accordingly, custom is the union of the pleasant and the useful. In addition, it requires no thought. End quote. So there is an ultimate explanation here for habit. We do things habitually for the reason that habit is ultimately pleasurable. You can do things out of habit without having to introduce thought. Thought can actually interrupt the free flow of instinct, the free flow of impulses discharging themselves. Once impulses become conditioned and regulated not just by outward pressure, but by the inward structures of habit, one can take pleasure in those impulses precisely because you don't have to make a decision. You don't have to weigh your choices. You can just act without bringing in the deliberating consciousness with the questions, what do I do? You just act. And for Nietzsche, as he will later write in The Antichrist, whatever is done consciously is done badly. And here he would say, at this period, it is done less pleasurably. Now, Nietzsche doesn't stick with the pleasure principle. He develops it into something far more encompassing, which he will call the will to power. But I would put forward the argument that will to power includes Nietzsche's conception of pleasure as a motivator of human life. It doesn't refute it. And indeed, the desire for pleasure and the experience of pleasure can be seen as one way of talking about the will to power. Nietzsche does so in The Antichrist when he defines the feeling of pleasure itself as being the subjective sensation of an increase of power. And so Nietzsche's musings on habit often relate to what was called the proof by pleasure, also known as the proof by strength or proof by power. This is church language. So a doctrine, particularly a religious doctrine, was traditionally justified by appealing to the pleasure that it gives us when the doctrine is followed. And so we would say that that's the power of the doctrine. We would say that that is its virtue in a non-moral sense. And that, in and of itself, is interesting to Nietzsche because it means justifying a moral claim on a non-moral basis. If morality is all about overcoming your selfish desires and your pleasure-seeking impulses, your self-seeking impulses, the church, nevertheless, justifies their moral doctrines in a roundabout way appealing to the same impulses. The power of our doctrines, they claim, is that they will lead you to happiness. They lead you to pleasure. We might think of the arguments of Pascal, which follow the wager, in which he says, even if you are not convinced of Christianity's truth, if you just adopt the Christian way of life and become penitent and generous and humble, and go to church and pray and so on, you'll see that your life will become better. You will become happier. You'll have more pleasure in life. It's not that the Christian way of life is the absence of pleasure. It's that the pleasure you take in the love of God, the pleasure in the Christian life, will be greater than any material pleasures, because that material pleasure is temporary, it's unreliable, it's ultimately unsatisfying. Just follow the doctrine and you will see. In Human All Too Human 120, Nietzsche writes, quote, an agreeable opinion is accepted as true. This is the proof by pleasure, or as the church says, the proof by strength, that all religions are so proud of, whereas they ought to be ashamed. If the belief did not make us happy, it would not be believed. How little must it then be worth? End quote. Now, this relates us back to habit, and that can be seen in a later passage in the same book, in which Nietzsche implicitly draws a connection between the pleasure of habit and all the states and social arrangements in which we live. In other words, we have these moral regulative regimes, as well as metaphysical beliefs that support these moralities. These are all based on errors, so why do they persist? So this is 227, quote, all states and social arrangements, class, marriage, education, law, acquire strength and permanence solely because of the faith of bound spirits in them. They exist then in the absence of reasons. Christianity, which was very innocent in its intellectual ideas, demanded faith and nothing but faith, and passionately rejected the desire for reasons. It pointed to the successful result of faith. You'll soon discover the advantage of faith, it suggested. You'll be blessed because of it. The state, in fact, does the same thing, and each father raises his son in the same way. Just take this to be true, he says. You'll discover how good it feels. But this means that the truth of an opinion should be proved by its personal benefit. The usefulness of a teaching should guarantee its intellectual certainty and substantiation. This is as if the defendant were to say in court, my defender is telling the whole truth, for just see what happens as a result of his plea. I am acquitted. End quote. So again, the consequences can't be a reason for dismissing a belief, just as indeed Hume argues. But Nietzsche says, nevertheless, this is exactly how the bound spirit reasons. By this he means the opposite of the free spirit. He means the common person bound by these pre-existing moralities and states and social arrangements. So we've gone through Nietzsche's early and middle period ideas on free will, causality, and habit. They are important ideas for Nietzsche, just as they are for Hume. At this point, I want to turn towards the final year of Nietzsche's life, his productive life, and consider what he says about how these ideas interact in his book, Twilight of Idols. This is in the Four Great Errors passage, which I've mentioned in the past. In fact, I've done a whole episode on that solely examines the critiques of causal thinking that are in the Four Great Errors. So go and check that out if you want to know more about this. But Nietzsche poses this question in section 3, quote, "In all ages men have believed that they knew what a cause was, but whence did we derive this knowledge, or more accurately, this faith in the fact that we know? Out of the realm of the famous inner facts of consciousness, not one of which has yet proved itself to be a fact," end quote. Now Nietzsche's not just addressing causality, like in the general sense in this passage. He makes a number of specific arguments about the way in which we are misled in our thinking about causality. So ways in which we reverse the effect and the cause or mistake the effect for the cause. I'm not going to address those arguments. Again, go listen to the episode about the Four Great Errors if you want to know more about that. What I'm concerned with here is the interaction between Nietzsche and Hume, and we have to notice immediately that Nietzsche sources the belief in causality again to the inner facts of consciousness, the immediate, direct perceptions we have of ourselves and our own volitions. Hume denies this could be the origin of the belief because he says we don't have the subjective experience we don't have this inner fact of consciousness, of free will. But Nietzsche would say that is an image of life that we have come to believe in because it is a better story than the previous ones, perhaps. It's something that we've come to believe in. But again, the key point is then how we understand habit. This is where we should turn our attention to Nietzsche's comments on habit and his comments on the proof by pleasure that once again appear in Twilight of Idols. And there's two excerpts that I'm just going to read in succession here. So this is from Four Great Errors, section 2, quote, "The most general principle lying at the root of every religion and morality is this: do this and that, and avoid this and that, and thou wilt be happy. Otherwise. Every morality and every religion is this imperative. I call it the great original sin of reason, immortal unreason." End quote. We can then look to section 5, quote, "To trace something unfamiliar back to the familiar is at once a relief, a comfort, and a satisfaction, while it also produces a feeling of power. The unfamiliar involves danger, anxiety, and care. The fundamental instinct is to get rid of these painful circumstances. First principle, any explanation is better than none at all, since at bottom it is only a question of shaking oneself free from certain oppressive ideas. The means employed to this end are not selected with overmuch punctiliousness. The first idea, by means of which the unfamiliar is revealed as familiar, produces a feeling of such comfort that it is held to be true, the proof of happiness, of power, as the criterion of truth." End quote. So just as Nietzsche's concern begins really with free will specifically and then expands to all causality, it's like he looks at the proof by pleasure of the church to justify religious doctrines, and then here, by Twilight of Idols, at the end of his career, he's saying the proof of happiness or the proof of power is the very criterion of truth. That whatever produces a feeling of comfort is what is held to be true. And as he says elsewhere in his notes on Will to Power, what is necessary for us to uplift something, elevate it into a truth, is simply that it is taken for a truth, that it is held to be true, that it is believed. Belief is the key element of truth. It's not rational justification. So we can see that this account of habit as explained by pleasure persists in Nietzsche's thought. But in this we can see the great difference from Hume, in that Nietzsche aims for a revaluation. His transvaluation of values, this project of overcoming morality, perhaps that can overcome this imperative to seek happiness, because it's really that desire to find comfort, to find happiness, to find pleasure in the familiar that drives habit. Again, for Hume, habit is the final explanation beyond which no further explanation could really be reached. And so the idea of overcoming habits, at least as regard our habits regarding the way we cognize the world, if not our daily habits, it seems obvious that those can be changed. But I mean, that whole notion is anathema to Hume, but the very fact that he uses the term habit or custom, he must have realized habits and customs are changed, right? So if he really wants to make that as a direct analogy, that would have to be implied. He might leave the possibility open if we read him charitably, again, given his moderately skeptical attitude. But it's very difficult for me to conceive of Hume getting on board with Nietzsche's project of the revaluation. It's very hard for me to imagine that he would buy into that. By explaining habit as something we engage in because of the pleasure it gives, Nietzsche is suggesting that overcoming the utilitarian seeking of pleasure allows us to overcome these habits of cognition. And by overcoming the habits of cognition, we can then overcome morality. Or perhaps it can all be part of the same process. It's not exactly as he draws a series of causal links between these things, because that would be, again, falling victim to the same thing. It's more like a fundamental insight that you have about how the whole system works, which begins to sort of demystify it and disabuse us of it. But by overcoming morality, we would even, by that same token, get beyond those metaphysical suppositions, such as causality. Not by peering behind the image of becoming, but by habituating ourselves to a new image of becoming which possesses more value for life than the previous image. Now, what is the previous image again? Why is it that it must be overcome? As we all know, Nietzsche's central confrontation is with nihilism. Nihilism for him is an inevitable challenge that we have to now deal with as a consequence of the death of God. We have to reckon with the fact that the Christian metaphysics and morality has led us to a place where the highest values have devalued themselves. It's another big topic in Nietzsche's work that we've discussed in the podcasts in the past. You can look up the episodes on the death of God or nihilism to learn more. In so many words, the morality which we currently hold is descended of the slave morality of ancient times, as Nietzsche calls it, which was then taken and utilized by priests, the classes of priests, as a way of acquiring power or holding on to it. The slave morality is rooted in the concepts of guilt, sin, and responsibility. The historical reasons for why this form of morality arose are detailed in the Genealogy of Morals, but the key point for our purposes is that Nietzsche thinks that this kind of moral conception is the entire reason why we conceive of the ego as a cause of actions. I've alluded to this already in the course of this talk. The slave morality is an attempt to wield power by those who possess no worldly power, no physical force or political power. It works by instilling mankind with the bad conscience. Guilt is its main mechanism. It's by making people guilty that they become accountable to the class of priests. In order to be made guilty, they had to be made responsible. And in order for man to be made responsible, he has to have control over his actions. And so that's where we get the idea of the sovereign, autonomous free will, the ego consciousness that governs over the self, which is a kind of neutral substrate between the self who acts and the action taken. Now, Nietzsche thinks that it's obvious that our actions come from drives and from impulses which have a pre-conscious origin, and our consciousness is just the commentary on an unknown text, that the ego can't be the cause of anything. But there's a passage on this in the Genealogy where he kind of shows how this works. I've quoted from this countless times, but there's really nothing better in Nietzsche's work for getting across how he thought about this dynamic. Quote, "Just as the people separate the lightning from its flash and interpret the latter as a thing done, as the working of a subject which is called lightning, so also does the popular morality separate strength from the expression of strength, as though behind the strong man there existed some indifferent neutral substratum, which enjoyed an option as to whether or not it should express strength. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, working, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction of the deed." End quote. Again, another subtle similarity to Hume, and that Hume questions the "I think, therefore I am" doctrine of Descartes. He also questions this idea of the ego consciousness in a kind of essentialized form. He doesn't think that the evidence, "I think," actually leads us to the proposition "I am." This would be echoed by Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. I believe it's number 16 as well. But following from all of this, I want to turn now to section 7 of the Four Great Errors in Twilight of Idols, where Nietzsche makes it explicit that the doctrine of free will comes from this desire to punish. It's not that we discovered it as a rational fact in the world, realize that people are therefore responsible and therefore we have to punish them. It's the reverse. We wanted to punish. Certain classes or castes wished to gain the right to punish. And from this, we derive the doctrine of responsibility. From that, the doctrine of free will. And from this, the doctrine of causality. And so it's all sort of this self-contained chain of necessities, but not logical or rational necessities for the image of life we have and the ways of life we want to preserve. And so this is Four Great Errors 7, quote, "Whenever men try to trace responsibility home to anyone, it is the instinct of punishment and of the desire to judge which is active. The doctrine of the will was invented principally for the purpose of punishment, that is to say, with the intention of tracing guilt. The whole of ancient psychology, or the psychology of the will, is the outcome of the fact that its originators, who were the priests at the head of ancient communities, wanted to create for themselves a right to administer punishments, or the right for God to do so. Men were thought of as free in order that they might be judged and punished, in order that they might be held guilty. Consequently, every action had to be regarded as voluntary, and the origin of every action had to be imagined as lying in consciousness." End quote. The reason why all of this moral thinking eventually leads to nihilism for Nietzsche is because the same mental operations by which we condemn certain human actions will eventually lead us to condemn the entire world. The problem for the moralist is that nature is amoral, and therefore when we examine the total picture of nature, we find so much that is morally condemnable that it leads us to the conclusion, seemingly as an inevitability, that life itself is guilty. That is the devaluation. Moral thinking, we might even say thinking in general, insofar as it's Platonic, exists as a means for us to make the world comprehensible, calculable. We might say thinking exists to help us become masters of nature. That's another coinage of Nietzsche's from Will to Power, though I don't recall which note at the moment. But thinking then turns about and condemns nature. It repudiates the idea that there could be anything of value in the natural world, because everything which gives pleasure, everything which we do, which is selfish, that has to be condemned according to this morality of selflessness. But Nietzsche would say even our selfless actions are selfish, even our ascetic impulses are followed because they give us pleasure. So even that's an error. But we don't have to thread a logical argument as to why that necessarily has to be the conclusion of the slave morality. Nietzsche would say empirically it is. Just look at where it has led us. Christianity ultimately rejects the material world in favor of communion with eternal God. Whether or not we think intellectually that the slave morality must always lead there, it seems obvious for Nietzsche that it has. And thus it's essential again that we overcome the slave morality, that we effect a revaluation in order to get beyond the dangers of this Christian devaluation. And this is the spirit of the final section of the Four Great Errors, which I do want to read from because it sort of defines the territory for us of how far Nietzsche is willing to take this experiment of thinking beyond causality. This really shows us how Nietzsche does not affirm habit and wants to get beyond the existing habits. So he writes, quote, "What then alone can be our teaching? That no one gives man his qualities, neither God, society, his parents, his ancestors, nor himself. This nonsensical idea, which is at last refuted here, was taught as intelligible freedom by Kant, perhaps even as early as Plato himself. No one is responsible for the fact that he exists at all, that he is constituted as he is, and that he happens to be in certain circumstances and in a particular environment. The fatality of his being cannot be divorced from the fatality of all that which has been and will be. This is not the result of an individual intention, of a will, of an aim. There is no attempt at attaining to any ideal man or ideal happiness or ideal morality with him. It is absurd to wish to be careering towards some sort of purpose. We invented the concept purpose. In reality, purpose is altogether lacking. One is necessary. One is a piece of fate. One belongs to the whole. One is in the whole. There is nothing that could judge, measure, compare, and condemn our existence, for that would mean judging, measuring, comparing, and condemning the whole. But there is nothing outside the whole. The fact that no one shall any longer be made responsible, that the nature of existence may not be traced to a causa prima, that the world is an entity neither as a sensorium nor as a spirit, this alone is the great deliverance. Thus alone is the innocence of becoming restored. The concept God has been the greatest objection to existence hitherto. We deny God, we deny responsibility in God. Thus alone do we save the world. End quote. To return to Hume, I think there's much that Hume would certainly have found congenial in Nietzsche's mission statement as he gives it here. Hume opposed above all else the cloaking of religious superstitions within metaphysical language. He opposed, for example, the doctrine of occasionalism, in which God is accounted an explanation of causality, effectively appealing to an occult quality and unexplainable explanation in order to rationally square the circle as to why we have a justified faith in causality. Hume, as an atheist, would certainly have agreed with Nietzsche that the nature of existence can't be traced back to God as a first cause, nor should it be. And yet, perhaps one of the best illustrations of their central difference is that Nietzsche does trace the belief in causality back to God in a way. He traces it actually back to the belief in God, whereas for Hume, or he connects those things, right? Whereas for Hume, it simply traces back again to habit. Beyond that, it can't be further explained. His thought halts at habit. That would be a key issue for Nietzsche, I think, in that he would see this halting in Hume's thought as comparable to, for example, Kant's non-explanation of how we are able to make synthetic judgments a priori. This was Kant's attempt to answer Hume. This was his attempt to rise to the challenge of Hume. It's another aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy I've discussed in a previous episode. That was back in Season 1, the episode on the congenital defect of philosophers, which goes into more depth on this issue. But one of the most famous passages of Beyond Good and Evil concerns this critique of Kant on the part of Nietzsche. He says, Kant says, that we can account for our belief in synthetic judgments a priori by virtue of a faculty. And that's supposed to be the overcoming of Hume's skepticism. Nietzsche doesn't mention Hume in that passage in Beyond Good and Evil, number 11, but in his notebooks, we can find the note which would eventually become developed into that passage in Beyond Good and Evil. And in the note, he does mention Hume, and when he brings Hume into the picture, it becomes very informative for understanding the contrast between the two. And so this is from a note which is entitled Anti-Kant, again from 1885. Quote, "Faculty, instinct, heredity, habit. Anyone who thinks they can explain something with such words must be modest and moreover poorly educated today. But at the end of the last century, this approach was rampant. Galliani explained everything in terms of habits and instincts. Hume explained the sense of causality in terms of habit. Kant, with great composure, said, it is a faculty. Everyone was happy, especially when he also discovered a moral faculty. Herein lay the magic of his philosophy. The young theologians of the Tübingen seminary went into the woods, all searching for faculties. And what didn't they find? Schelling christened it intellectual intuition, a faculty for the suprasensible. Schopenhauer believed he had found the same thing, and more, in an already sufficiently appreciated faculty, the will, namely the thing in itself. In England, the instinctivists and intuitionists of morality arose. It was the old story of faith and knowledge, a kind of formal faith that claimed some content. The history essentially concerns the theologians. Leibniz is quietly revived, and behind Leibniz, Plato. The concepts as anamnesis, etc. This movement, which begins skeptically, is in fact directed against skepticism. It takes pleasure in submission. End quote. That last line is very important. It speaks to the issue I raised at the very beginning, which is the question of the impulse behind our skepticism. Nietzsche doesn't just explore this in relation to Hume. I think that his comments on skepticism in the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, probably bear some consideration in light of this, but in the interest of time, I would just recommend maybe you could look that up as further reading on this topic. But Nietzsche says here, the movement that began skeptically is in fact directed against skepticism. It takes pleasure in submission, and I think he has to be invoking Hume, which he mentions in the passage, obviously. The fact that Hume says abstruse and accurate philosophy ought to be practiced in subserviency to the easy and obvious common philosophy. It ought to serve the interests of the moral philosophy that governs everyday life and everyday necessities. And so, as I've already argued, Hume's arguments aren't actually meant to skeptically question causality, but to skeptically question reason. And the fact that in the final chapter of Hume's inquiry, his skepticism actually turns against Pyrrhonism shows that his thought is not actually skeptical in essence. It's skeptical in service of his goals. The great problem with Pyrrhonism is its impracticability, the fact that it would, if we were to adopt the logic, or if we can even call it that of Pyrrhonism, we'd be unable to act. We'd be unable to deal with life's necessities. But here Nietzsche more or less says that Kant's faculty, quote-unquote, is in the same class of explanations as Hume's conception of habit, or Galiani's conception for that matter. Habit, heredity, instinct, faculty. These are served up as final explanations when they in fact explain nothing. And again, recall that Nietzsche doesn't even believe we have quote-unquote explanations. We have descriptions, we have stories about life, we have images of life. The question isn't how accurate they are, it's how compelling they are, how much they motivate us. So another very important line, this gives rise to the instinctivists and intuitionists of England. For example, Herbert Spencer, one of Nietzsche's targets, especially in the genealogy. But as Nietzsche says elsewhere, and in many places, the moral instinctivism or intuitionism of Spencer can be traced back to the empiricists and the mechanists, and primarily English thinkers. It all goes back to Locke and Hume for Nietzsche. And that may seem like an odd claim to make, to tie Hume to the mechanists. Isn't Hume's skepticism the opposite of mechanistic thought? He denies the logical reality of determinism in favor of this affirmation of custom. Essentially, he affirms the common sense beliefs as regards free will versus determinism, which therefore allows for this apparent logical contradiction of both liberty and necessity, because Hume says, we tend to think in terms of both. But if you study Hume's arguments on the rational level, mechanistic explanations of any kind are not, quote-unquote, justified. We have no way of knowing that when the billiard ball strikes another billiard ball, the same effect that we're used to seeing will happen, or indeed that any effect will happen. That's the sort of classic mechanistic example he uses, billiard balls. But I think, again, this is why starting with Hume's understanding of the role of his philosophy was so important, the abstruse and service to the active, and why understanding the framing of his arguments as taking place within a moderate or academical skepticism is so important. Hume is ultimately in favor of custom. You can't come away from Hume thinking that the point is to actually deny causality, but to accept it again as common sense. It's what we have to do. Just go with it. And this is why I think it's relevant to tie Nietzsche's comments on what he calls instinctivists or intuitionists to Hume. And we'll see a more direct connection with this in a later passage I want to look at. But the way Hume uses the language, he says specifically it's not intuitive knowledge that reveals the reality of cause and effect. But the reason why Hume chooses that language, I think, is because he doesn't want to establish cause and effect as knowledge in any sense. He's really trying to disabuse philosophy of its pretenses to serving as a guide for how we act. And if we can say that we have knowledge in some sort of intuitive sense, that there are intuitive ways of knowing, that still ends up conceiving man as a kind of rational being, and not first and foremost an active being. And it's also worth noting that in the case of the arch-rationalist Spinoza, to whom Hume finds himself opposed as an empiricist, Spinoza appeals to this kind of intuitive knowledge. But nevertheless, I think Nietzsche would be justified in this classification because he mentions intuitionist in the same breath as instinctivist, these two terms. And Hume does invoke instinct. He does invoke the pre-established harmony of our habitual causal inferences with the harmony with nature. And morally speaking, Nietzsche would effectively tie all this to a distinctly English tendency in philosophy, to look to the moral and metaphysical instincts we possess today, the habits and customs in thought and feeling and morals that we possess today, and reason backwards from this to an explanation for why those instincts are correct, or to justify them through nature in some way. Spencer is the prime example of this. Nietzsche would say Spencer looks around at the modern social values of cooperation and charity and community building and so on. And he asks, why do we hold these values? And he's assuming as a kind of working premise that these values must be adaptive in some way, that they must be of benefit in some way on the level of the species. And so Spencer creates a theory of evolutionary ethics, in which he says, our modern ethics has developed out of our instinct for self-preservation, for example. Now, Nietzsche's genealogy is an answer to this, as well as to Paul Ray, in that Nietzsche is also attempting to give an account of morality that, like Spencer's account, is historical, is evolutionary, is developmental. But in Nietzsche's account, the modern social values are actually a degeneration. There are a long series of pathologies and errors that were inculcated into the populace by a priestly caste, attempting to hold on to power by manipulating the resentment of the worst and most badly turned out members of society. And we've adjusted to all of those values of the worst among us. Nietzsche thinks that ultimately this way of thinking all goes back to John Locke and to David Hume. In other words, it all goes back to empiricism. Locke's role in this is clear if we bring to mind his social contract theory as we find it in the second treatise on government. For Locke, the natural and rational values that human beings seek after are life, liberty, and property. We might say undergirding these three are some familiar things, right? Self-preservation, protection or safety, and then the desire for a certain degree of rights, freedoms. Really, we can trace the whole self-preservation argument all the way back to Hobbes, the first social contract theorist, although, that might take us into the weeds because Hobbes is very different from these later theorists, in my opinion, very different in many ways. But a similarity that I think is maintained throughout is this notion that people establish governments to protect themselves from harms. It's the opposite of Aristotle's conception of politics as seeking the good. So it's not seeking the good, it's fleeing from harm. Now, while that conception works for comprehending Hobbes, he practically defined his project as opposed to Aristotelian politics. That would be it would be a reductive conception of Locke's political theory to say that's purely what it is for Locke. But nevertheless, we have this concept of natural rights in Locke, which are negative rights. It's freedom from some sort of danger or curtailment of one's natural abilities or freedoms. And we still have this notion of a kind of mutual and rational self-interest that was served by the creation of the state, which for Locke ultimately ends up being conceived as a kind of rational, voluntary act. And so in light of this, as I mentioned last time, Hume's ideas, the ideas of the British empiricists, go on to influence the utilitarians so strongly. It's sort of this whole story that Nietzsche, I think, would classify as instinctivism. It's all really the same thing. And Nietzsche would often take shots at Mill and others who took this value of utility and abstracted it into the catch-all expression for what the instinctive view of morality sees mankind as always pursuing. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. The good here conceived in social terms. It's based on pleasure and pain, and it's seen as, in this sense, natural. This is the natural moral orientation for human beings. It's the normal moral orientation. And as much as I like to take the piss out of Sam Harris for claiming he can leap over the ought-is chasm, this is not a new philosophical position by any stretch. Ayn Rand claimed to do this. Jeremy Bentham, one of the great utilitarian thinkers, claimed to do it. And they all claim to do so by appealing to this self-evident natural moral standard. It's represented as sort of instilled in us by evolution. It's something that can't really be argued with. We all want pleasure. We all want to avoid pain. And so on the social level, we have to reason to create, again, the greatest good for the greatest number. And so perhaps it's ironic, in light of this move to try and get over the ought-is distinction, that that's a phrase we get from Hume. This formula, you can't get an ought from an is known as Hume's guillotine. He slices down, he separates two different kinds of statements of fact and statements of value. And he says one can't be derived from the other. Again, this is why I find Hume, when I really started to think deeply about where to situate him in relation to Nietzsche, he can be a bit hard to pin down. And I think Nietzsche actually perceives him more clearly than most of Hume's critics do. Because, again, reason for Hume is the handmaiden of the passions. Reason can't even prove cause and effect. I would argue that Hume's point in his treatise on human nature is not to tell us that we can't ever get an ought. The point is to tell us that we can't get an ought from an is. In the same way, he says you can't ever get causality from reason. So the point isn't that you can't make inferences based on causality. In fact, you do every day. So Hume also is not an amoralist. He's saying you don't get morality from reasoning about the facts of the matter. And in this way, again, Hume and Nietzsche find a strange agreement on morality, insofar as they both see, with a fair degree of sobriety, that the issue of values is pre-rational in Nietzsche's language. All attempts at justifying moral positions with rationality end up being either an outright failure or a kind of attempt at a rhetorical trick, or perhaps preaching to the choir. But whereas Nietzsche affirms different values from the normal standard, identifying that normal standard as pathological, Nietzsche would say sick, Hume ends up influencing the utilitarians. And in a way, the utilitarian project follows from Hume's ought-is guillotine rather than denies it. The ought of the utilitarian moral standard becomes a kind of blunt fact, an axiom that can't be challenged or reasoned with. And so it's interesting that so many people who ultimately do promote utilitarian views, like Bentham or Sam Harris, they make this move of trying to deny the ought-is guillotine when I think they should just affirm it. They should just say, yeah, our morality is our irrational demand of a certain kind of life form. To me, that's the far more honest approach, and I think it is Hume's approach. Be a philosopher, but be still a man. We're human beings, we have certain values, certain wants and needs. Those are blunt facts, it's not something we prove, but fine, so much the better. That's how it is. It may not be rational, but we can trust our customs, because after all, if they were not trustworthy, they would have died out a long time ago. And meanwhile, reason appears so fallible, so unreliable in comparison to custom. And that in and of itself is a value judgment, by the way. That's an ought. We ought to follow our customs because they seem to be more reliable. That's sort of the operating logic of Hume that's not often appreciated. And I don't mean in the academy, by the way. I know that scholars are well aware of everything I've said here. I'm more referring to the popular consciousness version of Hume, the version that gets repeatedly attacked to this very day. For example, by religious conservative thinkers, because I think they see him as like a precursor to postmodernism or something, when nothing could be further from the truth. I think Nietzsche saw that clearly. He considered Hume in the category of these English mechanists or instinctivists that he opposed, because ultimately Hume is the enemy of all so-called postmodern thought. Hume would see all of that probably as part of the Pyrrhonian school of skepticism. What, you're just going to say all these things are actually just social constructs, or that you can't logically define a clear boundary line, therefore none exists? Hume might say, get out of here. We customarily use these concepts because they're useful. They may be constructs, they may be hard to define, but we have to use them. End of story. I should also mention Alex O'Connor. That's another great example of what Nietzsche is talking about as regards these English habits of thought. He's an atheist, a mechanist, he doesn't believe in free will, and he's an ethical emotivist. And I like Alex O'Connor, by the way. I think he's a great communicator, he's charming. We need more atheists like him around and less of the, what I'll call, the fire and brimstone atheism of the new atheists. I think theists tend to like Alex O'Connor as well, more so than the other atheist public intellectuals. And that's a big accomplishment. But all the pieces are there. O'Connor affirms an ethical theory based on how we feel about things. Things are right and wrong because we follow these instinctual judgments about what's right and wrong. It's driven by feeling, by sentiment. Reason is again the handmaiden of the passions. I don't know if Alex O'Connor has actually tied his emotivist thought to Hume, but it seems very congenial with that view, at least to me. And when I brought up this viewpoint of O'Connor's when I was on P.F. Jung's show, I saw some comments of people saying, well, we shouldn't just follow our emotions to say what's right and wrong. What if people are, what if they're disgusted by homosexuality, for example? Does that make it wrong? And I think that that's a confusion on the part of these people as to what I was saying. I think ethical emotivism is a correct description on O'Connor's part as to how people do think about morality. And I think Nietzsche and Hume are also in agreement about this. These are pre-rational, non-rational value judgments. That doesn't mean by affirming that description of how people think that I think there's not a magical process by which something actually becomes wrong or becomes right. I'm not a moral realist. I don't think any account of morality can give us that. I just think it's a fair description of how people think. And that was precisely Nietzsche's problem with reasoning from how we feel into a moral theory, by the way. How the people think, how the majority crafts their morality, the beliefs that they hold. Why should we trust any of that? For Nietzsche, it's self-evident. So much which is mediocre and decadent comes through in those values. They're not derived from some natural, rational process. They were beaten into us by Christianity and its offshoots. Moralities aren't accepted because people rationally assent. They're enculturated to believe in moralities as a form of the community's will to power. The way this manifests in everyday life is your conscience and your sentiments and your passions tell you, you gross, or yes, beautiful, or that's disgusting, that's bad, that's evil, or that's incredible, that's good, I find that laudatory. The reasons that you then give after this are post hoc following from the emotional reaction, the palette of sentiments associated with things. Now, this long detour into the morality of English instinctivists is important, because even though it doesn't seem to be directly related to the metaphysics of the mechanists or the rational claims of Hume as regards causality and belief in habit and so on, Nietzsche would say this is not a purely incidental result of the mechanistic view of the world. And I'm going to have to do a bit of extrapolating from Nietzsche's broader philosophy in order to make this point, because he doesn't directly make this critique. But I think you'll be able to perceive what I'm talking about if you read Hume's work. For Hume, our whole mental system of perception, and therefore of understanding, is what Nietzsche, and for that matter Deleuze, would call reactive or even passive. What do I mean by this? Well, for Hume, we, quote-unquote, receive impressions. The mind is described as receptive. The external forces just impress themselves into our minds. And all of our thoughts or ideas are traces. They're the less vivacious facsimiles of past impressions. To compare this to Nietzsche, he views our mental geography, as Hume calls it, in more active terms. We don't simply passively receive impressions. Rather, interpretation is active at every moment, every level of perception. The will to power interprets. Every drive has its quanta of reason. Every perception is determined by past and current value judgments. Our organs of perception can't be considered as merely passive receptacles of sense impression. They were shaped by impulses, by drives, that is to say by the will to power, to perceive in accord with the judgments of those drives, which is to say their valuations of what is good, what is bad. When Hume says that the eye, quote-unquote, receives visual impressions, he's setting up the eye as a kind of first principle, as a starting fact, as just a basic reality. But a truly evolutionary and historical account of the eye would understand its development as the active creation of an organism who determined that it was of value to see. This is not to say that this is a determination made in conscious and explicit and rational terms, but again in terms of a pre-rational valuation. For Nietzsche, nothing is passively received. Interpretations of value actively determine perception at every step of the mental process. If I were to be glib about this, Hume conceives of what actually exists in terms of matters of fact. For Nietzsche, there are no facts, only interpretations of the facts. And for all of his questioning of causality, even Hume's account of habit is, in a way, a kind of mechanistic understanding of human life. We act habitually, we might say automatically. Automatic is the best way of thinking about this critique because it's a term we also use for machines. We couldn't say spontaneous because our habitual inferences and thought patterns and behaviors are not spontaneous in Hume's account. They don't seem to be unpredictable and determined by the creative whims of the mind that is drawing the inference. They're drawn along predictable lines. The explanation of habit sets mankind into a predictable series of mechanical responses to certain perceptions. So we passively receive impressions. The sense organ is like an avenue along which the active forces from outside enter into us. We then draw connections according to impressions that are routinely conjoined. Insensibly, receptively, we build up stronger and stronger connections between impressions. Eventually, we become certain of these things, and this is what constitutes our beliefs. We then act out those beliefs in accordance with custom, which is a predictable natural mechanism in a way. It's passive throughout the entire process. That's what I want to get across here. Hume, whether he realized it or not, presents man as a kind of automaton of habit. And as a result of this, instinct or intuition ends up being validated, not critiqued, not challenged. Habit becomes, for Hume, a kind of natural mechanism that we can trust in because it always acts predictably to draw the inferences best suited to facilitate the necessities of life. That really is what Nietzsche hated about the English philosophers. I hope it's clear by now that Hume doesn't escape Nietzsche's wrath. The most biting criticism of the English philosophers, in which Nietzsche includes Hume, is found in Beyond Good and Evil. This is in Peoples and Fatherlands. The section number is 252. It's a long passage, but I'm going to read the whole thing because I don't think Nietzsche can really get his point across unless we read it in the entire context. Quote, "They are not a philosophical race, the English. Bacon represents an attack on the philosophical spirit generally. Hobbes, Hume, and Locke an abasement and a depreciation of the idea of a philosopher for more than a century. It was against Hume that Kant uprose and raised himself. It was Locke of whom Schelling rightly said, 'Je méprise Locke.' In the struggle against the English mechanical stultification of the world, Hegel and Schopenhauer, along with Goethe, were of one accord. The two hostile brother geniuses in philosophy who pushed in different directions towards opposite poles of German thought, and thereby wronged each other as only brothers will do. What is lacking in England, and has always been lacking, that half-actor and rhetorician knew well enough, the absurd muddlehead Carlyle, who sought to conceal under passionate grimaces what he knew about himself, namely what was lacking in Carlyle. Real power of intellect, real depth of intellectual perception, in short, philosophy. It is characteristic of such an unphilosophical race to hold on firmly to Christianity. They need its discipline for moralizing and humanizing. The Englishman, more gloomy, sensual, headstrong, and brutal than the German, is for that very reason, as the baser of the two, also the most pious. He has all the more need of Christianity. To finer nostrils, this English Christianity itself has still a characteristic English taint of spleen and alcoholic excess, for which, owing to good reasons, it is used as an antidote. The finer poison, to neutralize the coarser. A finer form of poisoning is in fact a step in advance with coarse-mannered people, a step towards spiritualization. The English coarseness and rustic demureness is still most satisfactorily disguised by Christian pantomime and by praying and psalm-singing, or, more correctly, it is thereby explained and differently expressed. And for the herd of drunkards and rakes who formerly learned moral grunting under the influence of Methodism, and more recently as the Salvation Army, a penitential fit may really be the relatively highest manifestation of humanity to which they can be elevated. So much may be reasonably admitted. That, however, which offends even the humanest Englishman is his lack of music. To speak figuratively and also literally, he has neither rhythm nor dance in the movements of his soul and body. Indeed, not even the desire for rhythm and dance, for music. Listen to him speaking. Look at the most beautiful English woman walking. In no country on earth are there more beautiful doves and swans. Finally, listen to them singing. But I ask too much. End quote. So this passage is a bit surprising. If you're familiar with what Nietzsche says about the Germans. And I puzzled over it for a long time in light of this comparison to Hume, because in that light my attention was directed to the issue of, for one, why Hume is included in this attack, but secondly, how Hume could possibly be unfavorably compared with Kant, someone whom we'll say that Nietzsche has very few positive things to say about Kant. On the one hand, it would be easy enough to simply try to understand this comparison by just appealing to the idea that it's just a matter of degrees. So it's a relative consideration. In many ways, the criticism of the English that Nietzsche gives here echoes criticism that he directs at the Germans in other places. We could say the only ones worse than the Germans, perhaps, are the English, from Nietzsche's perspective. So in comparison to the Mediterranean cultures and their thinkers, the Germans appear very much the way the English are described in this passage. But relative to the English, the Germans are cast in a favorable light. It is funny that for someone who describes himself as a Hyperborean, the further north you go in European civilization, the more disparaging words Nietzsche has. He allies himself to the, what he called, like a tropical view of life, and he's always suspicious of these cold, calculating, overly rational northerners. It's the type of mindset that he would say characterizes, or it gives us Luther and Calvin, and indeed Spencer and Mill, and so on and so forth. More interestingly, philosophy is presented in this passage as something which is not strictly rational, but which is a matter of depth. And again, Nietzsche speaking somewhat poetically here. You have to you can't construct his meaning from simply the rational meaning of the words here. And I think it would be too reductive to present this philosophical depth as something which we could simply call by the name of feeling or passion. Perhaps it would be too vague, but I think a better word would be wisdom. And we could look to one of Nietzsche's early notes entitled Science and Wisdom in Battle. And I think that designation can become somewhat more meaningful, in that Nietzsche sees wisdom as knowledge that takes in the whole. Spinoza becomes relevant again here. We might think of the third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge. That's the very thing that Hume rejects, but the kind of knowledge that can relate the finite to the infinite, or the parts to the whole. This kind of drive towards wisdom, the seeking of wisdom. Remember, philosophy itself is the love of wisdom. That for Nietzsche is a project that we can perceive in the pre-Platonic philosophers who sought the arche. They wished to make the total chord of the universe reverberate within themselves, to show the world, their image of the world, in their own mirror. There's something artistic and creative and thus, we might say, self-consciously semi-rational about this conception of philosophy. You don't attempt to proceed by small steps, drawing general rules from particular instances, but by great leaps, drawing upon intuitive knowledge. And if one is not speaking strictly logically, or if you're making arguments that are not exactly provable or rigorous, there's value even in the artistic element of their philosophy, because no one perceives the totality of reality, the entire canvas of reality, as Eckermann put it. When we paint reality on one of our earthly canvases, the limitless always is contained within the limited, and artistic license is therefore needed in order to convey insights that might not be possible to convey within the linguistic modes of communication that we have. Because after all, these modes of communication are created by these moral regimes. They're not created to represent truth, for whatever that means. They were created to be a code of signs to foster the advantage of the community. And we can see how, therefore, Nietzsche's comments on the English need of Christianity, the fact that they need it all the more because of their unphilosophical nature, in a way points to a kind of psychological compensation for the fact that their philosophical activity is so unartistic, so unwise, so purely bounded within this kind of scientific realism, that we might call it, or positivism. They don't have this focus on relating parts to the whole or seeking the one. Instead, it becomes about solving particular problems, or we might say accounting for particular phenomena. specific phenomena. Empiricism doesn't ever deliver us a comprehensive world picture. It's always simply providing provisional explanations with whatever we can perceive from our current perspective. And sure, there are attempts to provide grand unified theories within science, but no one has been successful in doing so. And whenever I guess I shouldn't say that. Whenever we establish one, it's knocked down in a few generations. So that's not really the point. The focus of science is experimental. It's specific. It's based on testing specific hypotheses. And a truly scientific positivist would look on all of our grand attempts at philosophizing as absurdity, as folly. And so what do the English do? Having embraced such an unphilosophical approach to life, they have to rely on Christianity for its moral and regulative function. The best they can do is to pantomime Christianity, to act it out, adopt it as a kind of coarse, unsophisticated, excessive religiosity as a counter to their lack of depth. And perhaps the highest humaneness an Englishman can aspire to is this kind of religious zealotry. And to prove this, Nietzsche says, just look at how they dance. It sucks. That's enough proof for him. Now, specifically as regards Hume, however, I think Nietzsche's point is salient, and not that Hume promotes a kind of Christian moralism as a self-conscious doctrine, but that his attitude is ultimately that it's good for one, literally, it's good for the people to continue to believe in Christianity. But more importantly, through his affirmation of custom, he ends up affirming Christian values. Like all the English philosophers, he doesn't necessarily understand them as Christian values. Perhaps these are just the natural, rational values to hold. And that for Nietzsche is precisely the blindness here, the blindness of all these English instinctivists. They halt at instinct and look no further. They don't inquire after the genealogy of the instinct, and we should expect as much, because that would be reaching into the depths, and they're not a philosophical people. Nevertheless, it may remain a bit puzzling still how Hume is treated in regard to Kant. The fact that Kant is almost presented as a heroic figure, maybe mock-heroic, but he's rising against Hume, and Nietzsche even smooths over and minimizes extreme differences between Schopenhauer and Hegel in favor of showing their mutual quote-unquote opposition to Hume. And this is why I think going over that passage we looked at from Nietzsche's notes, Anti-Kant, which served as a blueprint to Section 11 in Beyond Good and Evil, is very helpful in this regard. Because it shows that Nietzsche knows that there is a great similarity in the maneuvers that both Hume and Kant make. Kant had to delimit the boundaries of reason to make room for faith, after all. And this was the lesson that many German romanticists took from Kant. And that move, in substantially, it's almost identical to Hume, given the perspective that Nietzsche is taking here. There's this occult quality that can't be explained further, in one case habit, in another case a faculty. How then are we to make sense of Nietzsche's relative praise of Kant in Beyond Good and Evil 252? I think to understand this, we actually have to look to Nietzsche's earlier writings in Birth of Tragedy. In one of the later chapters, he actually describes Kant and Schopenhauer as opening the way for the Dionysian. And that's not normally a label that Nietzsche would ever apply to Kant, and I don't think he would ever use that later in his career. But we get an inkling of what he meant by that in this section of Beyond Good and Evil, because remember, the opposition that Nietzsche sets is the German idealists against the English mechanical stultification of the world. So a stasis, a rigidified view of reality, a view of reality that is, put it in physiological terms, like constipated. I use that phrase. It also accords with how Nietzsche talks about Carlyle. He says his philosophy is pessimistic, but it's pessimism as an undigested meal. And this takes us to the heart of the matter, Nietzsche's disagreement with the mechanists. It's a metaphysics of being. It's a Platonic conception of reality consisting of individual, substantial, calculable things, units, things that can be causes and effects. Now, of course, one should immediately counter me on this, that Kant and Schopenhauer fall victim to this as well. Indeed, they do. And Hume, at least in terms of the arguments that he gives following reason, would deny these things. Also true. And only with Hegel can we justifiably say that we have a metaphysics of becoming, for all the disagreements that one could find between Nietzsche and Hegel. But if we go back to the preface of Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche says that the dogmatic error of Platonism was that it denied perspective, the metaphysics of being turned truth on her head. in this regard, because it is perspective-less. And whatever the errors of Kant and Schopenhauer, it is with them that a sense for perspective at least becomes possible. The phenomena numina split breaks forth to this inevitable conclusion that our perception of reality, our experience of it, is patterned by a series of principles that we bring to bear in our perception, without which we couldn't cognize the world. And this makes possible a view of life in which we cannot separate the so-called matters of fact we perceive from the perceiver. And that's the best I can do at squaring the circle of Nietzsche's apparent praise of Kant in this passage, in contrast to Hume. Although, as should be clear, Nietzsche's own thoughts on this are not entirely consistent. It is likely, in my view, he sees Hume from different angles at different times. He comes to different conclusions as regards Hume's significance, probably depending on what force is seizing Nietzsche at the moment. And that's the case with many of the philosophers that he comments on. As such, it is difficult to come to a final conclusion as to how Nietzsche sees Hume. To wrap it all up neatly, tidily. On the one hand, he dismisses Hume along with Locke as a superficial thinker in one of his notes, also from 1885. So from the same period as the other passages in the notebooks we looked at, and from the same period in which he's writing Beyond Good and Evil. In this note, Nietzsche raises a number of other examples of philosophical minds, some of whom Nietzsche would consider dangerous, but all of whom he considers more profound. Again, that profundity that's lacking in English thought. And so this is from notebooks from 1885. Quote, Leibniz is dangerous as a true German who needs pretexts and superficial philosophies, audacious and mysterious within himself to the extreme, but without nobility. Spinoza is deeper, more comprehensive, more hidden in his depths than Descartes. Pascal, in turn, is deeper than Spinoza. Compared to such hermits of the spirit and conscience, Hume and Locke are superficial men. End quote. Pretty scathing, and yet perhaps it would be appropriate to end on a rare kind word from Nietzsche as regards Hume. And again, this is the same period from 1885. Nietzsche writes, quote, the finest minds of the previous century, Hume and Galliani, all familiar with public service. Likewise, Stendhal and Tocqueville. End quote. You could even interpret a kind of backhanded compliment into this statement, that they're all familiar with public service, depending on how you interpret that. But nevertheless, Hume is counted among the finest minds of the previous century, along with Galliani, Stendhal, and Tocqueville. For Nietzsche, that's rather good company to find oneself in. And so whatever the derangement of Hume's values inherited from his English enculturation, even Nietzsche would admit that the great Scottish skeptic possessed a sharp and powerful mind. Perhaps that would be the best note to leave off on, and I will leave it to all of you to determine whether there are more similarities or differences between Nietzsche's views and Hume's as regards habit, causality, and free will. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Hume. Some of the distinctions I've tried to draw out in this final episode are perhaps a bit fine, subtle distinctions, but I found the process of researching and writing this episode to be very rewarding because it led me to think about many things that I wouldn't have otherwise contemplated. There were many insights, many aha moments. My friend Quinn Williams was very helpful in the comparison between Nietzsche and Hume. He drew my attention to certain things that I don't think I would have perceived otherwise, or it would have taken me a lot longer to understand it. And so I hope I've conveyed those insights to all of you. That's all for this week, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.